Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 7 in the 50 most relevant for 2025. The players I believe across AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and Dream Team we must have a conversation about before we get to lockout and the Community Series matches. Zak Butters is who is on the agenda today. He's high in my 50. I'm pretty keen on what Zak's going to do for us in 2025. Is it warranted? Is it merited? Or have I just drunk a little bit too much of the South Australian water and maybe need to adjust? We will figure that out throughout this episode. Joining me on this podcast, a man that has been a part of the fantasy footy community for a long period of time. He is now one of the hosts and faces of the official SuperCoach podcast. It is a great pleasure to welcome back to the 50 most relevant. It's Dossy. Hello, mate. How are you?
G'day, MJ. Thanks so much for having me on. It's always great content coming on the 50 most relevant. And to show how far I've come, MJ, the last time you mentioned I have come on here before, welcome back, you said 2020, and I was bestowed with the honour of talking about number 41 in the ranks, Connor Blakely, back then. Superstar at Fremantle and Gold Coast. So appreciate the bringing me up a little bit in the rankings this time and talk about Zak Butters.
Yeah, both in a relevant player and a relevant number too. It is a dangerous territory to go back through the 50 most relevant in the 30s and 40s and see some names. My goodness me, I don't know if I've ever put Zak there, and I can't see him being that low in the relevancy orders in any time soon. Let's look back at what this 2024 season did deliver for us. A seasonal average of 120.4 in SuperCoach. Absolutely outstanding, and his price point, he is knocking on the door of that $650,000 price point. He's a pricey mother, but it's with good reason, as we'll dissect throughout this episode. While in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, a seasonal average of 106, and he's knocking on the door of $1.1 million across the formats. 175 was his highest SuperCoach score last year against the Tigers. You got to go back to 2023. Against Melbourne, he's got a 184 as a ceiling capacities about him. In that same game was his career high score in AFL Fantasy, a 148. Last year, his highest AFL Fantasy and Dream Team score came in a showdown. It was against the Adelaide Crows with a 143. Doss, these past 2 years of owning Zak Butters, since he's really emerged from being a pressure and a creative, dynamic forward option to now just being an absolute Miley Cyrus wrecking ball style midfielder, has seen him just ascend in SuperCoach and AFL fantasy scoring. And it's not just because he's a high ball winner. He just does everything to such an elite level, whether it be the tackling elements, his work rate, his impact in getting involved in score involvements, let alone winning the ball. He's just that perfectly well-rounded midfielder for us that from a fantasy football and a SuperCoach perspective, it's hard to find ways to stunt his scoring because he just scores in all the elements we need.
Yeah, he's simply a gun. He's come in and just taken the league alight since moving into the midfield, and he's just one of those really fun players to watch as well when you own him. As you said, 27 disposals a game, like effective disposals as well, which is in SuperCoach fantastic. So he's got the raw numbers for fantasy. He's got the efficiency for SuperCoach. He gets contested possessions and uncontested possessions, a heap of uncontested possessions, up near 17 a game. Loves to kick the footy as well. So I always typically look at players that do hit all stat lines. I know it's pretty common to look at fantasy and SuperCoach that way, but I like guys that come close to the 5 tackle barrier and then 25 plus disposals. That's the kind of players that I think are the elite tier SuperCoach scorers, and Zak Butters, fits that mold perfectly. Close to 5 marks, 4 tackles. So I think given his stature, he's probably never likely to, get that many tackles just because he is a bit of a smaller player, but the ferocity that he attacks the pill, the way he just plays footy is incredibly fun to watch.
14 tons last year for us in AFL Fantasy. Almost a 50% conversion rate of those being 120 plus scores. There are a couple of sub 80 scores in there, but if you're going, MJ, why have you got a 106 mid in AFL Fantasy? We get the SuperCoach thing. Why is a guy that's got 106 sitting inside your top 10 and ahead of names like Dawson and Bontempelli? Like, you're gone nuts, MJ. True story. I probably have. But his last 10 to end the year, he goes at 113. And so if you're worried whether or not he's got another level of scoring capacity within him, the answer is absolutely he does. He's top 14 last year for total points. He's ninth best for midfielders. And then in SuperCoach, an animal. Number 2 for total points, only behind Bontempelli, a 120 average. Not even a handful of players deliver that for us last year. He's one of those. And then 17 tons from his 23 games and an incredible conversion rate too. 12 of them 120 plus and some monsters in there too, that if you put the VC or C in him on those kind of weeks, it's incredible. Throw in some great durability over the last couple of years. All signs are looking strong. And Doss, it's probably not a surprise to us, but when Port Adelaide win, which has been more normative than not over the last couple of years, we do see he's a critical piece in their victories, but that helps us from a SuperCoach perspective too, just with the scaling and also the way he scores. He's unbelievable in those elements.
Yeah, I mean, he just has an impact of winning, and that's just plain and simple. Butters is a winning player. Just to speak to those numbers as well as to Port, when Port win, I've only got SuperCoach numbers here, apologies, but in Port wins 122 SuperCoach average, so that did include finals as well. And then in losses, he was just a 99 average, so clearly a driving force to the wins. I wouldn't be saying flat track bully by any means there, MJ, but clearly a driving force in their wins. And when Port lose, it's because opposition teams can either shut him down or find a way to sort of slow Butters, or he has an off day. So for me, that's a clear indication that he's a very impactful player. And you mentioned the difference between SuperCoach and fantasy of that impact, that efficiency. That's kind of where we see this come into play as well, as to why he is such an amazing scorer in SuperCoach, the second highest averaging midfielder that we can get, and coming with that uber premium price tag. So Jaden Popowski, who we know and love in the fantasy and SuperCoach community, he's put out this theory on Twitter, and I've had a look at it, and it's an interesting one to look at, MJ, when it comes to the 3,300 point rule in SuperCoach, which are the points allocated for a game in SuperCoach each week, which different to fantasy at kind of scale, there is a scaling element that happens post game. So he has said here, Port Adelaide get boosted up to 3,300 due to restriction and low disposal games, whereas like a team he compares, North Melbourne, are easy to play, causing more points to bring down to 3,300. So they're scoring over these points, so they're bringing their scores back a little bit. Port getting boosted up because of their restrictive kind of low disposal gameplay. So, his theory that he put out there was that Zak Butters playing for North Melbourne wouldn't be averaging 120. He'd be down near that 110, sort of 112 mark. Whereas a player like Sheasel, for instance, if he was playing at Port Adelaide, he'd actually be going up in average because, North Melbourne tend to get scaled the other way. So, while there's different variables that go into that,
of course.
It's an interesting theory.
And it helps give us that confidence of you can look at, there's like a 14, 15 point per game gap across the formats. Where does this come? Well, it's that combination of what he does is so highly valued in the impact that has on the game of football, that is scaled differently in correlation with how Port Adelaide play the game of football. You put those variables together, and that's how you do see impacts like Butters, where you go, and others, oh man, that feels like such a big scaling, and fantasy, that's just 2 points or that's just 6 points. It's like, well, yes, but what SuperCoach gives is a greater indication of impact on the game of football itself, both for better and worse, so that when you kick the ball and you turn it over, you will be punished for it. Whereas in fantasy, we'll just take the sneaky +3, put it in the pocket and run on. And that's why we've loved certain players in that format. And in SuperCoach, we've been frustrated by them because they're a high accumulator and a poor user, whereas others like a Butters, he's not a low accumulator by any means, but he's not high, as you mentioned. He's only in the mid-20s from a possessions and a disposals perspective. So I think it's important for us to have that kind of sitting in there. I know literally just before we have recorded this episode, you were actually down at Port Adelaide training and watching a match simulation. I've got a hypothesis that
Okay.
I'd love your thoughts on, and it feels weird to bring up Dan Houston in a Port Adelaide midfield discussion, but I think there's a thread I'd love your thoughts on. Last year, Port Adelaide were the best team in the league at scoring from kick-ins. Dan Houston shared that responsibility with a Kane Farrell, who still hasn't really got into full training just yet. And Dan's obviously now a Collingwood Magpie. I wonder, from watching training and just seeing how this Port Adelaide ball movement is going, do you think we'll see any kind of evolution in their game style and ball movement? The reason I want to bring that back to someone like a Zak Butters is if that ball is not just pinging through the midfield because they've got a high playing options that can generate scores from kick-ins and generate rebound 50s and do the ball movement that players like Houston had done for them in all Australian levels. It does make me think the way Port move the ball could be quite different, and that might benefit someone like a Zak Butters with seeing some disposal and possession increases should ball movement come in a different form than it had previously. Have you seen or got some thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's we don't, as we were sort of talking pre-show, we don't want to take too much out of match simulation. There is certainly a grain of salt to be had when you're versing your own team, and you've even got some fill-ins. So for context, there was a guy like Hamish Hartlett was out there suited up for Port Adelaide today, and mind you, racking up still. If he was an option in SuperCoach, might jump on board. And a Matty Lobe was playing as well in the ruck. So there is some sort of grain of salt to be had, but looking at that, theory about Dan Houston going out, what's going to happen to their game plan? Not only who's going to take those disposals, which is obviously another point of real interest for us in the fantasy community, but is the game plan going to change? And as I said, it is very early, but I really like that idea of looking at how it might impact the team. And just looking today, there was guys in the defensive line for either team, obviously, but like Rory Atkins was taking kick-ins. A guy like Dylan Williams was having to step up and take a bigger role. You had Bergman down there doing different things. So they didn't have a Kane Farrell who, if he just takes that bulk role, can he do what Houston did last year? Can he take even more kick-ins than he did before and be involved in those chains up the ground? And maybe that their game plan doesn't have to change as much. But from what I've sort of seen there today, it was a lot of midfield usage, clearly. I mean, all the big dogs were in there. They didn't have a break. Mind you, they didn't rotate forward or anything. So it was your Butters, it was your Rosie. Jason Horne-Francis was absolutely in there as well. So one other thing I'd like to mention is on the Keeper League pod with Hef, I did sort of take note of what Jordan Sweet said in that he's probably got a bit more of a license to roam around and get his own pill this year, assuming he's that number one ruck. So maybe to your point, if that is the pathway of just generating more movement forward with just the midfield moving around the ground, that sort of probably speaks to that. So as a theory, I like it, MJ.
Yeah, and that's where for me, why I've got him so high in the 50 most relevant with the AFL fantasy bent is I think this, you just can't replace an all-Australian caliber player like a Dan Houston with what's in the depth in your list. And that's not a crack at Port Adelaide. It's just nobody can replace that level of depth on their list that is that brilliant without subsequently bringing other trade assets in that can match that. And they just haven't done that. So to me, I think that's where I'm quite optimistic that a 110 average in AFL fantasy is within his scope because his tackle numbers aren't that high. His mark numbers aren't that high. His disposal numbers aren't that high. He's only getting a goal every 2 games or so. So it's not like it's, the market share of split between Horn, Francis and Rosie, it's already so high. Now they've got this ball movement change. So to me, I'm quite optimistic that whatever change we do see from Port Adelaide, I think it helps Butters. I also think it helps Rosie for what it's worth too. And it's why people might be looking at him early. In SuperCoach, we know, and you talked brilliantly around how some of the elements of SuperCoach help his scoring. But he's got real VCC options about him, especially in SuperCoach. There's some good ceiling in fantasy too, but certainly in SuperCoach is more. This fixture looks pretty good to me, Dossy. No early bye. The Magpies, the Tigers, the Bombers, the Saints. A couple of tough ones in Hawks and Swans. And then North. If you're spending up almost 1.1 million in fantasy, near 650k in SuperCoach, you're going to need a hot start. And that fixture does lend itself to a potential hot start.
Oh, yeah. And particularly that Richmond matchup in round 2 stands out as a monstrous one for Zak Butters. His favourite team, I'd say, to score against there as well. So if you're looking for a hot start, that would be awesome. I mean, yeah, you mentioned Essendon as well in there. His top averaging team to play against. So Richmond, I'd say, has a little bit of an impact being his third best team to play against, just because I remember him getting injured in a game that he was absolutely dominating at one point as well. So, you need, obviously, you're paying the big dollars, paying the second most highest priced midfielder in SuperCoach, and in fantasy, he's still incredibly expensive there. So you got to hope that whether you don't need necessarily improvement, but you do need that ability to put the VC and C on him, as well as you want, the same output at least from the previous season. So I think with the early fixture, that does look juicy. There's probably a slight issue with maybe a round 4 tag against St Kilda if they decide to go that path. But if we're all presuming that Horn Francis is now going to play even more midfield or go in there as his running mate, Horn Francis is going to be lovely to be that, tag target next to Butters that probably will be the number 1 tag target if he's playing more midfield, given that, when he's off the chain, he really is doing similar stuff to Butters, but maybe just more of that body that really extracts straight out of the midfield, whereas Butters kind of gets involved on that second chain. So, as you mentioned, sort of a few of these things, I've been growing an interest in Butters. And one other little thing, just touching quickly back to what you were mentioning about the different ball movement. I was just looking at one thing I really like to look at is like meters gained per disposal. I gained this from Stevie Fizz at my time with the Draft Doctors, but he looks at this stat as, how a team moves the ball. And it kind of speaks to that point of they had the third highest meters gained per disposal, meaning that they kick further for each sort of mark that they have, like per disposal. So, or mark or like just general disposal. But if Port don't have that Dan Houston meters gained, so he was in, one of the higher meter gain players in the competition. Kane Farrell, his teammate, was above him, but that could really change that ability to get those short chip marks out of defense to be able to move that second chain sort of thing. So, yeah, again, I'm sort of, my mind's being changed here on the spot here, MJ, as we continue to go through these stats.
I think one of the challenges that people have with selecting Zak Butters too is, man, he's priced at a spot that I think there's a marginal upside. I don't think you're really picking him. Certainly as SuperCoach, there's not much upside when you're going over 120, like he has done. But you're picking him over probably someone else. And so, a Marcus Bontempelli is comparably priced. Do you have a greater trust in a Bont than you do a Butters? In an AFL Fantasy, you've got a Jordan Dawson. Who's comparably priced. You have a little bit more confidence about what he is going to do in comparison to others, let alone the plethora of depth of value that we have that has largely come through the injury narrative, let alone players that have changed roles and clubs. It does get hard to go, do I feel safer with a Bont, with a Dawson, with a whoever, in this spot over Butters? And that's probably where his ownership, while it's fine across the formats, it's probably not as high as what his averages and rankings from a scoring perspective of last year probably would see him be at normally.
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Yeah, and this is probably my gut feel more than anything that I want to sort of talk about this. But you mentioned it off the top of the show, the Miley Cyrus wrecking ball that is Zak Butters sort of contributing to that. As you said, there's no real, the injury narrative isn't quite there with Butters. 26 games last year, although let's mention he did get injured before heading into finals. So if you actually look at some of his final stats, they're actually really quite poor for his standards if you look at his finals performances, but that was because he was carrying an injury there. So there was a little bit of an issue back at the back end of last year. But in general, 26 games, then 25 games the year before, 20 games in 2020. So the injury narrative is not there, but the way he attacks the footy, his reckless abandon for his own body and his own safety, he is one of the more aggressive players in the AFL, and that's why we love Butters. That's why we also, have such high respect for him crashing into those packs. But it is sometimes nervous being an owner, as you're just like, just look after yourself a bit, Butters. Just chill out a bit, man. But look, you can't use that to not select somebody. But if you're talking about comparing him to a Bontempelli, a Dawson if he was more in that premium bracket. But like these guys have the bigger bodies, which. Butters is 180 centimeters, but he walks into the contest like he's 200. So sometimes it's a worry from looking at a game, and it can give you a bit of panic. But at the end of the day, his body has held up, so I don't want to put that as a negative towards his. If you're going to pick him.
Yeah, he'll give you a couple of heart palpitations every year. But the injury narrative, at least that was plaguing him in the early portion of his career, the last 2 years, he's knocked that on the head for the most part in terms of missing games, ruling him out of games as a story. So to me, the reason you're fading Zach is probably one of two reasons in a starting squad. You like someone else more at the price point, and or you think there's more value to be had underneath that you're still happy to look as vice captaincy and captaincy options. Because while we might not be looking at Zach as a value buy, you're looking at him with that strong early start, with that historical pedigree against opponents, both on 2024 data and, as Doss has pointed out for us, what he personally has done on these teams too. You're picking him because you think there's vice captaincy scoring and captaincy scoring that you can capitalize on, and that those ceiling games are going to come early, and you get ahead of the pack with that regard. So he's not a quote unquote value buy, although there's a narrative that we've shared about how he could see some scoring improvement. But that's what you're looking for here. This is not a value selection. This is a armband captaincy selection. And if you don't start him, well, it might be a hard way to get some money to get there to him, but he feels like to me, I don't want to end my SuperCoach season without a Zak Butters. That's for sure. He's gone from 113 in 2023. He's up at 120 now. Dossy, I know we can sometimes in the fantasy community be only looking for scoring improvement and minimize regression, but it probably requires a Jason Horne-Francis to really have a Brownlow style season, and for this forward function to probably pick back up a bit for Butters. It feels like those two variables need to both come true to see a significant enough regression that Butters isn't SuperCoach relevant for us this year.
Yeah, I think spot on. Like, he's going to be up there as one of the best midfielders in the game, regardless of what happens in our system. I think we're going to have him at some point, but it's whether you want to start him, whether you want to trust him above, there's other massive names that are up at the top of the price bracket, whether you want to trust him as your guy that's going to take it to the next level. And just to be the devil's advocate here,
Please.
MJ, because we probably haven't looked at much of the kind of downside. You mentioned a potential Jason Horne-Francis Brownlow season. I mean, what I was seeing at training, might be on the cards, to be honest. But no, I think there's the mouths to feed factor could be impacting as other players do get more centre bounces. We've got a healthy Connor Rozee. As I said, he's in match sim at the moment as well. So hopefully a healthy season for him. But does that mean that it's going to impact how Zak Butters can continue to just rack up disposals as this midfield unit grows around him? I'm the devil's advocate here. I personally think, as you said, I think he can, whether or not he can take his game to another level, I certainly think he can at least replicate what he did last season. And with some of those early matchups as well, it probably justifies you starting him in your starting squad. But yeah, it's just something to consider. I mean, Willem Drew as well isn't in the mix at the moment, who's typically played midfield. Does Ollie Wine sort of step back a little bit in his role? So I don't know. There's a lot to consider with Zak Butters, but at the end of the day, he's a top-end premium and he's a gun.
Look, if you're not bullish and confident that he's going to replicate, certainly over the first portion of the season, the type of scoring that he's priced at, you just can't go there. Like, these are the season-killing moves. It's really easy in correctional trades of ends of rounds 1 and 2 and 3. If you get that mid-pricer wrong, okay, trade, off you go. With the boosts in Dream Team and SuperCoach available to us, all right, we can fix up even faster, let alone the volume of trades that are available to us. We can get ourselves out of jail in these cash cows, stepping stones, breakout options. We can get out of them within a week and it not hurt too much. What really sets your season back is chucking down a 120 in SuperCoach and a near 110 price point in fantasy and getting 5 to 10 points per game of regression. Not only are you losing the cash, but you've overpaid now, and others that are 10, 15, 20 points underneath that are matching that performance. Not only have they been able to redeploy that cash in their starting squad to a greater impact, they are now set up ready to get on the guy that you paid top dollar for. They are now able to get them at their potential bottom price. And so now you're doubly behind. So you have to nail your top end guys. This is where it really stunts your seasonal movement, is where the guys that are captains, vice captains, big chunks of salary cap, slow starts, this is one of the biggest handbrakes for your season. And so if you've got any sense of doubt about the role of Horne-Francis, the market share of Port Adelaide, the ball movement, whether or not Butters can replicate what he's done over the last 2 years again, if you're not sure, despite a good fixture, just don't go there. Watch, observe, see what comes, and then react. But if you're bullish, there are enough reasons to be that he could come and average 130 in the first 4 weeks and you're away. And that's in fantasy, not just in SuperCoach. There is a world where his ceiling could absolutely be one of the best premium mids to set yourself off to the start of the year. But on draft day, just one of us will get to own him. At the coaches panel, we choose to draft on the keeper platform, whether it be a single season, whether it be a dynasty or a keeper league. But there's no better time to be a draft coach because there is a number of platforms that let you do your single season and keeper leagues as well. Dossy, I know you've done your SuperCoach draft ranks. Where does he sit for you as an option on draft day?
So just among the midfielders, I have him third, and that's just below Bont, a superstar in the SuperCoach platform. He's been an absolute gun in the mid-high 120s the last couple of years, so he's ahead of him for me. Also potentially more midfield, responsibilities with Treloar out of the side to start the season. And then I've got Nick Dacos second, who averaged less than Zak Butters last year in SuperCoach, but I just think he's a superstar that could definitely take his game to the next level, who had a bit of a slower start. Zak Butters I have third in a similar tier to a Caleb Sarong, who I believe you've already talked about on this show. So I kind of have Dacos and Bont up the very top, and then I'd be very happy with Butters as that sort of next guy down the ranking. So, if I'm talking about him as the third best mid this season, then, we're talking about a gun keeper in the salary cap format as well, and just a guy that we can trust. So, I'm on board. I'm on board with Butters. Absolutely. Do I think he can improve massively on his already pretty high average in both formats last year? I'm a little less convinced on that front, just because I wonder how it happens. You mentioned maybe a game style change could impact, and I'll be keeping a close eye on that in the preseason. But the other thing is centre bounce attendances, which we didn't really talk about, and I know the fantasy community loves talking about that. I certainly do as well. I'll just briefly touch on that because I know Ken Hinckley has not been a guy that likes to give high centre bounces to any one player or any one unit. He likes to spread them around. He has done in the past. I've seen some numbers out there as well from Jaden, I think it was, saying, he's never given people more than a certain amount of centre bounces. But Zak Butters last year was the team leader at 68.5% during the season without those finals involved. But could we see that it hasn't allowed them to go to the promised land yet? Could we see a bit of a mixture where it's much tighter unit, where it's just a Butters, just a Rosie, just a Horne-Francis, and then these other guys are kind of finding their way elsewhere? I doubt it personally, but it's just it's a possibility. High 60%, still high, but there's midfielders in the competition getting in the 70s and 80s. So if he could ever sort of just roam free as a midfielder permanently all game long and not have any sort of rotation, and also he's got under 80% time on ground, does spend a fair bit of time on the ground, but a couple of options there for improvement if you just wanted to look at those raw centre bounce kind of numbers that we all do love to look at.
Just on the exit of the podcast, Dossy, just dropping a few little gold Macca's nuggets on the way out the door, just to move your mindset left and right. I love that you've done that for us, mate. Hey, it's been so much fun to watch and see what the team at the official SuperCoach podcast have been bringing for us this pre-season proper. So many videos, so many audio podcasts. Where can we keep in touch with some of the great stuff you and the team are doing? And what have you got planned for us as we head towards opening round?
Yeah, just give us a follow on the socials, the SuperCoach AFL official channels, wherever you like to check out socials. We're everywhere. So whether it's Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all those good places you can find us. Yeah, probably as well. Just the podcast. We've tried to really revamp that in the off season, and we're doing stacks of podcasts at the moment. I think we did 4 this week. I mean, you're a man that loves a podcast, MJ, so you'd know all about the podcast grind. But we are really trying to sort of ramp that up, including a little bit of the draft content as well throughout the preseason and in season. So just jump over to the podcast, give it a listen. It has changed quite drastically over the last year, so we hope to sort of bring back a bit of a SuperCoach presence in the podcast space. So that's all. Thanks so much for having me, MJ. Glad to be not talking about Connor Blakely this time, although last time, just take everything I said with a grain of salt, because last time I did compare Connor Blakely to Sam Doherty. So everything with a grain of salt, guys.
If you want to go and check out any of the podcasts that the SuperCoach team are doing for us at the moment, or some of those social media spaces that Dossy's mentioned, we've got them in the description of this episode, so you can just go in there, click through those links, and go and check that out. They are churning out the content for us as a community at the moment, which is fantastic. It's so great to see one of the official platforms really driving hard and giving us great conversations to be able to check out. So whatever it is that you like, they're probably talking about it. Go and check that out. If you're just catching up on the 50 most relevant, we've been talking about a player per day since January 1, and we are almost at the end of this series. You can go back and check out wherever you're consuming this episode. Everything else is already sitting there. If you want to watch these episodes, you can. We are on YouTube. Just subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and comment below. Let me know, what do you think Zak Butters is going to average this year? And if you haven't left a 5-star rating yet on the audio podcast platform, make sure you do. It takes you 2 seconds, but it makes a huge impact for us when you do something small to support the coaches panel. Inside the description of the episode, not only are the links to get in touch with Dossy and the team at the official SuperCoach podcast and to grab their episodes, but it's also where you can keep in touch with us, get your hands on some coaches panel merch, and become part of our Patreon. All the details for that in the description of this episode. So there's not too many more midfielders to go in the 50 most relevant. There's a couple of forwards, maybe a ruck, and maybe even a defender. I think we're going to hit every position through there. But there's one player that I think every person desperately wants to own in 2025. There's one player that just induces a greater sense of fear that if you do not own this player, every single quarter you are watching them play, you are just nervous knowing that 50 and 60 point quarters are on their capacity. And if you're an owner, there is no greater smug feeling that when this guy gets on a roll, he's absolutely dynamite. And we look at his price point and we go, well, it's probably what he is. But I think there's a world of upside. And at a heavy price point, to say there's upside, it's pretty rare. And if this guy does what I think he will in 2025, I'd rather own him sooner than later. Who are we talking about? You'll find out tomorrow on the 50 Most Relevant.